Few serenades hit quite like "Where is Rutger?" And guess what? He wasn't home as the Winnipeg Jets downed the Pittsburgh Penguins 6-3. Find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. On today's episode, obviously, the Jets have finished off a weekend where they took on the Pittsburgh Penguins and won a big 6-3 victory over a team that, quite frankly, gave them a fair bit of struggle. I know the scoreline may look very much in favor of the Jets, but this was a very seesaw game, and I think it did a good job of highlighting both where the Jets are strong and where they still have a lot of question marks. I think that this team is very much still figuring out what it is, but based on last season's performances and some of what's coming this season, I think they are off to one of the more interesting starts where there's a lot of room for growth, and then there's also some areas where, compared to last year, they have grown a lot. So a very interesting team. I don't think anyone expected them to be unbeaten so far, 5-0 to start the season, but obviously you could say that the team hasn't faced as many top opponents yet, and that's where Pittsburgh, I think, was probably one of the higher quality opponents that they faced. But even the Penguins have their own rather large drawbacks, and we'll talk about which ones the Jets were able to take advantage of on tonight's episode in just a moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets beat the Penguins 6-3, and it was a pretty interesting game. The Jets really didn't have a ton of power play opportunities, and so all of Winnipeg's goals came on, 5v5, or in one situation, a 6v5 and an empty net. So for the most part, the Jets had a score at even strength, which is pretty unusual. You don't often see this offense this year doing that, but I think where Pittsburgh's been deficient this year is definitely in terms of their defensive structure and goaltending. Alex Nedeljkovic got the start in net, and that was probably a bit of a help. It seems like the Penguins have had real issues with their goaltending, and so Ned being in net was a bit of a boost for the Jets offense, and it kind of gave me some confidence that this may be a game where Winnipeg could come out with a fairly lopsided scoreline, and it did. And the other part that helped was that the Penguins' defense was very bad in the slot area. We saw numerous breakdowns and moments where I thought, Pittsburgh should have cleared the puck and maybe sealed off a jet skitter along the wall, and Winnipeg ended up taking advantage of a mistake, a blown read, poor effort, and just kind of cut them apart in the slot area. But there were also stretches where, Pittsburgh kind of did the same to the Jets. I would say that this was probably one of Winnipeg's worst defensive performances so far, especially from the second period on. The third period was a little more back and forth, but the second period was very firmly in Pittsburgh control. This after the Jets basically ran the first period, but then, right at the end of the first period, they ended up getting a penalty. This one came because Logan Stanley ended up making a pass that really should have hit his line mate in stride. He had like three options, and I think he threw it right at Pionk's skate, which was just a little confusing. It was a pass that pretty much you want him to make, and unfortunately it turned into a counter on that whole sequence. Colin Miller takes a penalty, and at the start of I believe it was either right at the tail end of the first, at the start of the second period, it was Kevin Hayes ended up scoring on the power plays. So a little frustrating, but I mean, it happens. It is what it is. Things probably started to get a little bit nervier when not long after that, Lars Eller scores, and you're kind of like, you're hoping that things are not starting to roll this way. But like Pittsburgh really dominated offensive possession for like most of the second period. And it seemed like you just needed some sign of life from this team where the Jets could maybe get something going. Thankfully, there was a delayed penalty call, and on a great pass from Ehlers to Connor. Connor absolutely just undressed Ned with a nasty release, and that's the good stuff from Kyle. That's what you really want to see him doing on a consistent basis. He just ripped a shot right through the goaltender, and just like that, the lead's halved. And then later in the period, thanks to the efforts of a Colin Miller rebound that gets put away by Mark Scheifele, and then a beautiful 4-on-4 goal from Ehlers to Nemesnikov that was quite pretty. You should definitely watch it. Suddenly the Jets had the advantage. Obviously, that lead didn't quite last because at the start of the third period, Eller sniped one after Miller tried pinching a little further up the wall, and then Stanley, unfortunately, he did try to block the shot, but his ability to rotate into that lane didn't really help. Comrie got beaten pretty cleanly over the shoulder, and Eller sniped a pretty goal, admittedly. But after that, the Jets' offense kind of started to find a few greasy goals. The Lowry line, which had been trying to win its matchups against the Crosby line, didn't go so well, but in this period, they were able to get some really great contributions from Lowry and then Appleton. Really important stuff to see when, maybe your top six isn't scoring as much as you'd like it to. And so, having the Lowry line there to back you up is always really nice, especially when the Lowry line basically plays second line minutes. So Niederreiter capped it off with an empty net goal. Everything was, happy vibes. I think what this game showcased, again, was that the first line really did struggle to make a significant impact. I think this was the first time that they've actually scored as a unit on the ice when it's 5v5, which is great. Not so great when you look at the history of the last few games. And in some of these games, they haven't been able to control play the way you'd want them to. Obviously, in some games, they've definitely won the shot battle and the expected goals battle, but it's not that frequent. Usually when they are outperforming their opponents, you compare them to their other lines on the Jets roster, and those lines are actually winning their battles in more impressive fashion. But you really need the Scheifele, Connor, and Velarde group to start actually putting stuff in the back of the net. When they're not, they aren't really offering as much elsewhere. So, bit of a tough game for them. The Nemesnikov line had another strong game. I think it's one of those situations, and I see some people commenting on the last episode trying to say that, or it was a previous episode about the second line center thing. People are like, oh, there's no problem. You're worrying about things and yada, yada, yada. Look, you may think it's not a problem right now because the Jets record is good, but you have to understand the trend and the longer term thing with this team that the Jets are still trying to figure out their 2C thing. And against better teams and better opponents, at some point that stuff's going to show up. You think it's not right now, but I promise you, when you get to the playoffs and you start facing actually good teams on a routine basis, it ain't the same. I'm sorry. It's just not. And it's why I still think this Jets team needs to make some kind of a trade, or if maybe one of the prospects does really well in the minors, promote them up to help boost this top nine. Because as it is right now, it's an okay team in some capacity. Like, at 5v5, they're generally doing enough to break even or beat some of these matchups. And against bad opponents, they've really piled up some of the chances. But I think against top offenses like this Pittsburgh team, it was a little dicey. It was a little nervier than you'd expect. And not all of your opponents are going to have garbage blue lines and goaltending tandems. So for the Jets, I think it was certainly a fun game, a very high-speed game. But you did see on several occasions where the Penguins were able to hem the Jets in and really get some zone possession that made it hard for Winnipeg to do much of anything. So I think that's going to be a theme against these faster teams. Somehow, despite trying to get faster in the offseason, it does still seem like the Jets are a bit sluggish, but hopefully they can kind of get around that at some point in the future. But, I think that this is going to feed more into a longer conversation about, what we can take away from the 5-0 start. I think this team has had a great franchise start. It's the best in this current iteration of the franchise's history. But again, like I said, that there's lots of room for growth. And I want to chat about that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed because they help you schedule, screen, and message so you can skip a lot of the busy work and get connected with top candidates immediately. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster, 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. And, as somebody who's actually used Indeed myself, when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to how good their resume building system is. It's detailed, it's comprehensive, and it's very intuitive. And when you actually submit all of this information and you start looking for jobs, it aligns to what your work experience is, what your domain and interests are, and your salary requirements. So for an employer looking for some of the best candidates out there, I can only imagine that it's super convenient, super helpful, and there are over 3.5 million businesses already using Indeed worldwide to find top quality candidates like yourself if you're listening and you're one of those folks looking for work. But if you're somebody who's an employer looking to hire, I recommend that you give Indeed a shot, because listeners of this show will even get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about Winnipeg's start to the season, which I think is very interesting. It's not been the kind of start to the season that I think I entirely expected, but then there are some things that very much align to either what I thought would be good for the Jets coming from the offseason, and maybe some things where I think they're struggling a little bit more than maybe even I was expecting. So things that I think the Jets have done really well. I would say when the power play gets set up, the first 5 games, generally speaking, it's been good. The only problem is when the power play struggles to get those zone entries and struggles to get guys in position. I think Pittsburgh really did a good job of making Winnipeg's limited power play opportunities absolute nightmares. The first power play the Jets got, they basically never got settled in. Any of their zone entries immediately got shut down. And even if they were inside the offensive zone, Pittsburgh quickly forced turnovers. And just like that, the power play pretty much died immediately. So that part is still a bit of an issue. I think it's something that's been a problem for a while. And it's maybe the only thing holding this power play back from being, crazy, right? When it's actually getting time to set up, it's phenomenal. The puck movement and stuff on the whole, sure, you can see some individual mistakes and stuff, but, again, I look at the net, right? I look at the overall trend, and I think the power play is venomous. It's lethal. And I think if as long as it gets set up, it's really, really good. The PK, I'm still kind of trying to work out. I can see some of the theories and concepts, but I feel like I need a larger sample size to get a better read on how well it's working. I will say that I've seen them disrupt some of the puck carriers a little more. I think that they're applying pressure in the right ways. And so I'm inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt that it'll at some point start to result in some stuff. They've conceded a couple of power play goals in the past couple of games, but I'm not too worried. I think the overall theory, at least, just to get this unit to a more league average state is probably there. We'll see if the goaltending is able to back that up and if the Jets PK is able to get more aggressive. I haven't really seen as much of the power kill with like Connor and Scheifele, so that could be something to keep an eye out for. They've done it a couple of times, but it's not as often as maybe I thought. And that just may be by nature of how the Jets matchups at 5v5 are going, so we'll have to keep an eye out for that. But speaking of 5v5 play, the Jets are kind of an odd team right now when it comes to that sort of stuff. And I know that like people are, again, saying we don't have a second line center problem. We don't have this. We don't have that. But listen, we've beat up on bad teams, but we're not really facing some of the league's elite yet. The Penguins, I would say, are the first team that's had a really top-ranked offense that the Jets have come across. Now, the good news for Winnipeg is that the Penguins have one of the worst-ranked defenses and really rough goaltending, especially to start the season. But the offense is no joke. And I think against this attack, you saw the Jets kind of have some issues, in terms of being able to dictate the pace of play and create. After the first period where the Jets definitely controlled play and were the better team, from then on, it got a little dicey. The second period was very much domination by the Penguins. The third period was a little more seesaw and back and forth. But on the whole, Connor Scheifele-Velarde, I just don't think was able to do the kinds of stuff that you really want them to. They weren't able to skate as freely. And like sometimes they had a couple of good sequences where they'd get some really nice shots off and stuff, but it wasn't as often as you would probably like. And, the Lowry line, this was one of the few games where when you look at the shot attempts, the expected goals battle and everything, and really just watching them visually trying to exit the defensive zone, they really had a tough time. They could not win their matchups as cleanly as they've done against some of their other opponents, and that may just come down to Crosby and Malkin being menaces. But it felt like the Lowry line, which is one that you really kind of have to have rolling in order to make your other lines a little more productive. It was tougher sledding for them. So it was really good news that the Nemesnikov line was able to pull together things and have some pretty good games. I would say that it wasn't perfect, and there were times when the Nemesnikov line absolutely got buried in the defensive zone. It felt like they couldn't cleanly exit, and it took them a while to make puck recoveries a thing. But once they did, they ended up getting up the ice. But a lot of it probably came down to Ehlers trying to make stuff happen, and it's why I continue to think that he's really not being used to the most of his value, and it's frustrating because I feel like the Jets have maybe handicapped some of their potential with some of the ways that they have arranged their lines. This team, I think, could do more to bury their opponents and really drive play against some of these higher end offenses that they're going to be facing over the next few months, but as the team is currently constructed, it's doing okay and it's treading water. But I think at some point, you have to think about the longer term and some of the underlying stats that perhaps paint a little more of a complicated picture. And I think people also maybe mistake me for being either upset about the team or angry at how things are, or maybe they think I think this team is bad. And I don't think that's really the case. I just think it's a squad that just doesn't have the kind of room and margin for error that some of these other teams do. The Jets don't have the superstar talent up and down the lineup like some of their other opponents have in the past. I know the Avs are kind of a different story this year, but in past years when Colorado was really good, that team just had so many individual superstar talents that could win shifts that the Jets just don't have, right? And because of that, Winnipeg has to do things by committee. So if any of your lines are struggling to win their matchups, it makes life very difficult for everyone else. And something that, I think is going to be a problem that probably pops up later this year. I think in this current streak, the way the Jets have won, it's not something that's particularly sustainable, for the long run. The Jets may still be able to do it for a while, but I think once you get to the playoffs, which I still think the Jets are definitely a playoff team, but I think once you get there, I think you'll start to see some of the same issues that we've had in past years. But that's if the team just stays as it is right now. I think Winnipeg probably is aware of some of these issues, and maybe they're taking a look at the deeper numbers, and maybe they're getting a sense of things being a little more nuanced and complicated. It's why, when I get these comments like, I guess this problem resolved itself or something, I feel like people are not really looking at stuff from the right perspective or the right lens. I try to take a very holistic view and really dive into not only some of the advanced metrics, but also some of the historical trends with this team. And I think the Jets are in an interesting spot where right now goaltending, team defensive structure, and the special teams are really carrying Winnipeg through this streak. But they have to figure out the 5v5 stuff to help more in the long run. If they can do that, and if they can start to get these lines functioning, all four of them and rolling, I think you have a different assessment of this team by the end of that. But until we reach that point, this team is definitely a little vulnerable in a couple of areas, but that's fine, right? It's early enough into the season to where you can address and fix this. It's just a question of how you do it. And I think Arniel was maybe not as keen on making some of the adjustments that I would prefer, which, I mean, it is what it is. I don't have an input, or, most of us don't, but I do hope that he's at least a little open-minded about potentially changing some combinations, maybe going with some new lines. At any point, I just kind of want some changes. I think the team has gotten, a really good result from the first 5 games, but how they've gotten there, I think, is where I have some interesting questions. But again, it is still early in the season. There's plenty of time to experiment. I think that's why I'm really keen on the Jets trying stuff now rather than later when you're deeper into the year and you start finding yourself backed into a corner. better to get yourself on the right track now and with really good winning habits early before you find yourself needing to be, to make changes later in the year and you have maybe less chemistry, less familiarity, all that kind of stuff. It's still early enough into the season where you can reasonably make those adjustments, have guys kind of work together for a bit and start to really settle in for the rest of the year. So intriguing 5-0 start. The Jets are the only unbeaten team in the league right now, which is pretty darn cool. I didn't really expect them to start this way. It's not going to last. At some point, the Jets will have to lose. But, so far, at least the nice thing is that, in terms of Winnipeg's schedule, I think the next few opponents are not going to be super crazy. The Blues are a team that I think the Jets could probably beat on the road. The Kraken, a little bit harder. But then one of the only other top record teams right now is Saturday's opponent in Calgary. So that's going to be an interesting game. The Flames, I feel like, are one of those squads that's maybe punching a little bit above their weight right now, but they've played some pretty exciting hockey. We'll see if the Jets can perhaps douse them against a team that's really given Winnipeg fits the last few years, not just because the Jets sometimes lose to the Flames, but also because we seem to lose players against them when they try to concuss guys like Perfetti and whatnot. So crossing your fingers, no injuries. Let's have a healthy road trip here. Then, Monday, the following week, you get Jets versus Maple Leafs, and then a bit of a tour of the East for a little bit until Winnipeg finally gets to face Utah for the first time at the start of November. So next few weeks are going to be pretty busy. Lots of interesting opponents. We'll have our Central Division rivals come through to start November, which personally I'm pretty excited for. You'll get a real test against the Stars, against Utah, some form of the Avs. We'll have to see if some of their injured stars return. I don't know what that team is even like at this point, but yeah, a lot of moving parts. But one of the things that I think has kind of stuck out to me recently is sort of concerning the time on ice deployments. And I've mentioned Ehlers needing to be used a little bit differently than I think he is right now. And in particular, when you look at the time on ice distributions from something like just this past game against the Penguins, some stuff kind of sticks out that I think concerns me a little bit. We'll chat about that and why I think Ehlers is a particularly unique case with this in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our title sponsors at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We are now 7 weeks through the NFL season. The Ravens play tomorrow or later this evening, actually, which will be great. I'm excited for primetime football. Some of you maybe have had rougher weekends. Maybe your games didn't go so well. If you're a Vikings fan, I apologize. If you're a Jets fan, good luck with that. Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to save that franchise from it being the New York Jets, but maybe something changes, right? And maybe you get a hunch about Rodgers and his team in the middle of one of their future games. Well, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com or on the mobile app. Get started and get in on the action right now. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about an interesting time on ice split that started to emerge with the Jets recently. And, I think it's a problem for me because how Winnipeg tends to run its lines is a little concerning if you're focused on skill and how the Jets tend to try and match up, right? And what's happening right now is that the Lowry line is your second line, it's fine. I think this is a really good line. They've generally won their matchups. The Penguins game was probably the first exception this season where, the Lowry unit has maybe struggled a bit. But one thing that's kind of come out of this is that the Mestikov line really hasn't had the sort of trust that I think we were hoping for, and continues to really trail, the other lines in deployments, which when it's doing poorly, I understand and I agree with. But it's been doing better the past couple of days. The concern that I have is that Ehlers is playing, a total of less than 13 minutes in a game, which just should not happen. With Perfetti, I'm just going to kind of limit the number of grouses that I have, but Ehlers is probably your most creative player. And in this game, I think you saw why the Jets really need him. Winnipeg doesn't have many creative wingers of his caliber. And if you have Ehlers playing less than 13 minutes, you're just not getting enough out of him. I don't care how you do it, how you find more ice time for him. That's not my job. But I think the coaching staff really needs to make the most. Like you're getting 20 minutes out of Connor, out of Scheifele, 17 minutes out of Lardy. Surely there's a way to get a couple of extra shifts for Ehlers somehow. And I know that, partly it was because there weren't as many power plays. And technically, Ehlers did play, almost as many shifts as the top line. But by the same token, you just have to find a way to get him more ice time. If you have to double shift him with other lines or something, do it. The guy is one of your most creative forces. He is a difference maker, and this team without him is just not the same. I know that he's not had a great start to the season, and I think the first couple of games he was really rough, and then things have started to kind of pull together over the last few games to where I think he's looking more like himself, but you still see those moments where it just doesn't feel like the line combinations are as favorable to his skill set as you'd like. So for me, it's a weird thing, right? You see on paper, it's the same thing that happened with Bones last year, where he would say that Ehlers kind of short-shifted and maybe came in earlier than some of his line mates, which I get, but I also think you have to just play him more then. Find a role for him somewhere to support the offense that gives him more shifts. I think his productivity and what he brings to this team and how creative he can be is certainly dynamic enough to where if you're not really getting him out on the ice as much, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. And I often see criticisms of him making risky passes, and some of those are very accurate. There's no mistaking the fact that he will commit turnovers, and he'll have issues sometimes when he tries to make a really risky play. But the net with him is generally so positive that if you want to help drive results at 5v5, if you want to spark this offense, then you've got to find a way to make him a more focal point of your attack. The team right now is getting by with what it's got going, but like Adam Lowry, Mason Appleton, these guys are like 30, 40-point players, probably at their absolute peak. Lowry's best season has been 36 points. Appleton's best season, 36 points as well. But you look at the broad record for these guys, 25 to 30 points most likely in most seasons. And maybe it keeps up this year. Maybe they put up career numbers this year. But I would imagine that it starts to taper off. And when that happens, you kind of need your big guns to really carry that load and burden. And that's where I think, Ehlers not really playing that much. Perfetti probably needing a few more deployments. It's just going to catch up to you when your Lowry lines, your fourth line, some of these other groups either stop carrying play or stop scoring, because the top line really hasn't been scoring loads either together. So it just, to me, it leaves a lot of room for potential issues the deeper you get into the season. Now, maybe things really go crazy and the Jets are able to sustain this kind of play for months on end. But again, like I said, my focus at this point is really about the postseason and what happens once the Jets are in the playoffs. That's where Winnipeg has not been the same team. It appears to be in the regular season, but all of the problems that they tend to have and carry into the postseason really get exposed by those faster, more skilled opponents. So hopefully, this year ends differently. Hopefully Arniel keeps an open mind, maybe thinks about some ways to rearrange things. I will say I've been really impressed with a couple of players who have had really good starts to the year. Lowry aside, I think Appleton has done a really marvelous job of being a really versatile middle six piece. He had a 3-point or a 2-point night against the Penguins, and one of his plays, a beautiful assist to I forget who actually finished it. It might have been Lowry. Beautiful, beautiful pass. Oh, beautiful one-touch pass. Really couldn't make it any nicer. And just a great, great goal. Really heads-up play from him. He received a Josh Morrissey slap pass. Didn't really have the angle to take it, but just sort of dropped it off for Lowry, and Lowry had an open net. Also, really got to give some credit to Neil Pionk. He has had a great start to the year. He's been much better than I expected. Already quietly, racking up almost a point per game kind of performances, and generally really seems to be earning it. It's not like one of those things where it's just inflated numbers against bad opponents. He's just played well. And if there's anyone that I'm really rooting for to have a good year, it's probably Pionk. He's always been one of those guys that I feel is really accountable and consistently talks about his own limitations. And so for him to get, rewarded for his hard work and to have a strong year, I think would be great, right? Really rooting for him. Hope it sustains for the remainder of the season. We'll just have to wait and see. This is still early in the year. Lots of room for growth, lots of room for changes if it comes to it. But so far, the Jets are 5-0, and I think they can take a lot of pride in having that kind of start. The games ahead will certainly be testing, and I'm sure Tuesday's game against the Blues will be a real slugfest, so we'll have to see how that goes. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with Blues coverage and see how that game goes. Hopefully, we get to talk about another victory. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.